One of the most enticing things about Festool is their packaging. Almost everything they sell comes in a really nice and surprisingly small box called a Systainer. And these Systainers stack and lock on top of each other so that you can move them from job site to job site. I, however, don't have job sites to travel to, and while I love this method of packaging, I found that when I need to use a tool, it's often on the very bottom of my stack, and this quickly becomes annoying. As such, for my next project, I've decided to do something about it. The plan is to build a mobile base for my MFT table that places each Systainer on its own slide-located shelf. This will allow each Systainer to be accessible independently while still taking advantage of their organizational proficiency. So let's get started. For this project, I decided to skip over the big box store entirely and head to my local lumberyard in hopes of finding higher quality sheet goods. What I found was a sale rack stuffed with 3/4 inch birch that was pre-finished on both sides for only about $30 a sheet. I bought 3 and then quickly got to work with my track saw. My idea was to cut both the top and bottom to my cabinet that was sized the exact width and depth of my MFT table, thinking that this would ensure that the footprint of my new cabinet would not intrude on the clamping functionality of the extruded aluminum sides of the MFT. Once I had these cut, I then used the bottom to sketch out a design for the cabinet. What I should have done was draw out my plans first, but as you'll learn later, I'm a sucker for learning the hard way. Speaking of, when I bought the sheet goods, I wasn't thinking about joinery at all. Since this plywood is pre-finished on both sides, glue would be ineffective, and I really wanted to use dominoes over hardware on this project. Alright, so here's my idea. I am going to route some 3/4 inch dados for all of my joints, but I'm just going to route them deep enough to remove the finish off this plywood, and hopefully no deeper. And how I plan to do that is simply zero out my router as I normally would. It's now zeroed out, lock it in place, and then come with the fine adjustment. And each click is 3/1000ths of an inch. So 3,000, 6,000. That's my plan. Take 6/1000ths off and hope for the best. This is my test piece, and it looks like 6/1000ths of an inch was just enough to remove the top layer of the ply and get into the glue that bonded the first and second layers together. I think that'll be okay. Really, what's so critical about my measurements in this project is that when I'm done, I want this cabinet to be the same height as an MFT table on its legs, just in case I buy another one in the future and want to tie them together. And I think since I'm actually just making it, a hair bit shorter, maybe an 1/8 inch through the whole project, if I need to, I can add shims to the casters at the bottom of the cabinet to get it to the proper height. But we'll see if this test works, so stay tuned. Okay. Shitty planning, router fix test number 1. I think it's plenty strong. Took the wood, so we're good. So with that hurdle jumped, I finished cutting my parts and moved on to routing my mini dados. In my last video, I bagged on the Festool router's ergonomics a little bit, and I was wrong. I've used it quite a bit more now, and I'm actually quite impressed with it, and really impressed with the accuracy of its depth stop, obviously. Anyway, after I finished all that routing, I moved on to joinery. This cabinet required a ton of dominoes, and like before, I found the Festool domino to be really easy and remarkably fast. So long as I had my references set correctly, this thing was dead on accurate and a joy to use. And with all of those dados routed and dominoes dominoed, it was time for my first dry fit of the cabinet. This is where shit went south. Remember when I mentioned that I should have drawn out my plans for this cabinet before starting? It was only after dry fitting that I realized I hadn't given the Systainer sections of the cabinet enough width to account for the 1-inch wide drawer slides. And it's at this point I would show you evidence of this, but I'm trying to keep it clean, and it wasn't a pretty picture. I was both frustrated and disappointed, and it was just absolute proof that the best tools in the world do not make a good craftsman. Essentially, all of my work to this point and the money spent on pre-finished birch went to schooling. I learned a hard lesson, took a couple of days off from the shop, and taught myself how to use SketchUp. Now, armed with this new skill, I then drew up dead-on accurate plans of the cabinet. They're pretty rad. I'm super happy with them. And if you're interested in the file, just check the comments below or get on garagejournal.com and you can download them for your own use. Anyway, it was time to head back to the lumberyard. This time I went big and I bought 3/4 inch Baltic birch of a pretty high grade for around $65 a sheet. It was money well spent. This stuff was so much better than the pre-finished birch that I'd bought before. The veneer was just a lot thicker, and as a result there was no tear out on either side of the ply when I cut my parts again. And of course I had to redo all of my joinery as well. At this point I consider myself a bit of a crack with the domino, on the level with Ice Cube, no doubt.
I'm with it. Domino, mother. Say about that.
And then it was time for the glue up. Due to all of the combined joints on the cabinet, this was kind of complicated. What I decided to do in the end is sort of glue it up from the inside out. I started by gluing up the vertical inside panels while they sat on the bottom, which I left dry. And then once that glue had enough time to set up, I then removed the whole thing from the base and glued up both the base and the top and used a ton of weight for clamping force. It worked okay. And once everything was done drying, I was left with a cabinet that I was really pretty happy with. My measurements I came up with on SketchUp were accurate, my joints were super tight, and everything was just sort of where it needed to be. Given that, I decided it was time to put a finish on it. I used 5 coats of polyacrylic from Minwax, sanding between each. I like this stuff because it dries really quickly and it's just easy to work with if you use single long strokes and a decent brush. With the finish done, I could then bolt on my 3-inch casters. And then I took some 1 1/4 inch dowel rod to the table saw and cut it into 4 equal lengths of 1 inch. These were then screwed down onto the top of the cabinet where they act as a sort of wedge that locks into the bottom of the actual MFT table, keeping it from racking either fore or aft. It actually worked quite well. Finally, after all the screw-ups on my part, it was time to make the sliding shelves for the Systainers. I decided to use 1/2 inch Baltic birch for these, knowing that I wanted to reserve as much vertical space as possible for the Systainers. I started by cutting the width of the shelves out of a 4x8 sheet, and then used the MFT table on its new cart to cut each to length. This went really quickly, so I began trying to figure out exactly where I wanted each Systainer to end up in the cabinet. And once I had that figured, I then installed all the bottom sliders and shelves. From there, I then created spacers from scraps of plywood for each size of Systainer. I could then stack these onto the slider below and have perfect spacing no matter the height of the Systainer I was installing. I've never done this before, and I'm sure there's a better way, but it worked, and it actually went quite smoothly. This is my prototype shelf, and essentially what I did was I glued a block out back and then a smaller block up front with a notch cut out for the Systainer notch that captures when you stack. It's not very elegant, but it's simple, and it locks the box in pretty tight. So all to do now is cut out a bunch of those blocks. I cut the rough shapes of the blocks first and then clamped them together using my table set at a 1/4 inch height to cut all of the notches. Again, I don't know if this is the right way to do such a thing, but it felt safe and it only took a couple of minutes to get all of the blocks done. Afterwards, I set up an assembly line of sorts and just banged out all of the shelves using glue and a couple of brad nails in each. I think they'll be plenty strong. To finish them off, I did the whole sand poly sand deal again 3 or 4 times and got them all smooth with a matte sheen. And then once they were dry, I got the shelves in the cabinet and the Systainers placed within. At this point, it just felt really good to see some functionality progress. They worked exactly how I'd hoped. And now for the big finish. The drawer is located at the back end of the cabinet. I started on the table saw cutting the widths of my fronts and backs out of 3/4 inch Baltic birch, and then my sides out of 1/4 inch. I would have preferred to do this on the MFT table because the dust produced by my table saw drives me mad, but the MFT table just doesn't have the capacity. But once I had the widths of the stock cut, I could then move to the dustless environment of the MFT table and cut them all to length. Before I moved on to joinery though, I decided to cut 1.5 inch finger holes in the fronts using a Forstner bit. And I don't know why, but I love using Forstner bits on a drill press. Anyway, that done, I got down to business with the dominoes again. I used 4mm dominoes this time and had all 4 drawers done in less than 20 minutes. Like I said, come at me, Cube. Before I glued them up, I ran each part through the table saw twice to get a 1/4 inch dado for the bottoms. This all went really quickly, and I was getting pretty excited until I realized I only owned 4 clamps, and each drawer required my entire inventory of clamps. So yeah, glue up took a while. But after a few days of glue ups and a few hours of work with polyfinish yet again, I was ready to tackle the drawer slides. Alright, so my plan here is to leave a 1/4 inch gap between each drawer, and I've created this kind of template out of 1/4 inch plywood to use as a spacer. And then I'm using a 3/4 inch piece of plywood to actually space the slider 3/4 inches up on the drawer itself. Never done this before, so take this with a grain of salt, I guess. Okay, so now that I have the sliders installed in the cabinet, I will take the 3/4 inch spacer out, leave the 1/4 inch spacer in, and slide my drawer in. Then I'll pull it out just enough to get to the first hole on the slide itself. And drive a screw in. And now that I have one screw already in, I can set the slider to be level and drive the rest of the screws I need. And now it's just a matter of installing the drawer. Nice and smooth, it worked. So essentially, I just replicated this process all the way up the cabinet, and eventually I got the top drawer installed. I was pretty relieved to see that, again, my SketchUp measurements were accurate and all of my drawer gaps were consistent from top to bottom. That made me pretty happy. And that's it. She's done. It took me twice as long as it should have, and it cost me more than it should have, but I finished. And you know, one of the things I learned while doing this is I don't really know how to build things with wood yet, and I also don't know how to video myself building stuff with wood. And so learning both at the same time was pretty challenging, and I lost a lot of clips out of frustration, and I'm just happy to have this thing done, man. So thanks for sticking around and seeing me through it, and we'll catch you next time.